Welcome back to another episode of Light Beer, Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble.
And I am Chris Clements, a very gravelly Chris Clements today.
Well, yeah, that happens. So today this is the ongoing
And Happy New Year,
Happy
Sean.
New Year, Happy New Year. It is January 5th, and today is the continuation of the "We Were Wrong" and our guest was right episode. We had Rich Tao a couple weeks ago who had pegged this last election pretty well, and someone who got it even more right is our guest today.
Yeah, Mr. Simon Rosenberg.
Simon Rosenberg nailed it.
Yeah.
He was telling us that there was no red wave, and we kept saying, "Oh no!" Even on Twitter, I was like, "Simon and I totally disagree, although we're very friendly." And afterwards, we'll be able to say, "I told you so." And so here, Simon, you can live up to the promise I made on Twitter that one of us can say, "I told you so," and guess what? It's you.
Yeah.
And Simon's been doing a bit of a victory lap too online.
Well, should.
It's been great.
Should.
It's been a while. Listen, I mean, this was a crazy journey because, I mean, in addition just to being, a guy who does political analysis, I, started going out and speaking to groups all over the country that wanted to believe that we had a shot, and who were mobilizing volunteers and all the kind of grassroots work. So I also started, my followers on Twitter exploded, and I had 100 million Twitter views between the middle of October and and right after the election, for my hopium, as Nate Silver called it, that I was giving to the Democrats. But obviously, as a Democrat, I'm very pleased with what happened in the election. I think that two quick takeaways, and then I'll let you take it wherever you want to take it, is that, first of all, I think there were really two elections. There was a bluer election inside the battleground states and a redder election outside, and we can talk about what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is that this was a big pundit fail. I mean, in 2020, there was a data failure. But in 2022, I think there was an analysis failure. I mean, the data that we were looking at, that we were talking about, saying we didn't think there was going to be a red wave, was publicly available data, available to anybody. And a lot of people, including Nate Silver and folks like Dave Wasserman from the Cook Report and others, really got the election wrong. And there's going to have to be, I think, there was a big discussion after 2020 about what to do to fix the data problem. Now we need a discussion about how to fix the analysis problem, which is in some ways a more, it's a more serious problem in some ways, because there was just so much data that contradicted that there was a red wave, and it was all ignored, by a lot of people. So, it's been a fascinating election, and obviously, you can imagine as a Democrat, very pleased with what happened in Arizona, still kind of shocked by the scale of the victory for Democrats there. But the Southwest outside of Texas has been the Democratic Party's probably we've made the biggest gains anywhere in the country in the last 20 years in the southwestern part of the U.S. And you guys are ground zero for that.
Well, and
we appreciate being ground zero for a lot of things.
The
election integrity,
right? Well,
Democratic gains. I mean, it's been a wonderful 2 years.
There have been gains. I mean, obviously, New Mexico is becoming bluer and bluer. Colorado has gone completely blue for the most part.
Yeah.
And that's been 15 years in the making.
Yep.
Arizona, I would not say Arizona's blue. I would say it's purple. It remains purple.
Yep.
I mean, we had a candidate problem, obviously, because if you look at Kimberly E., who ran for treasurer for re-election, she was just kind of mainstream, regular Republican, and she got 56% of the vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then you look at Carrie Lake, who is leaned very much into the election denying and the pro-Trump side, and she lost narrowly, as did Abe Hamada. And then someone who didn't lose very narrowly, lost kind of big, was Blake Masters. And that was in part because Captain Kelly was a much better candidate than Katie Hobbs in that regard, as far as how that election played out. So, speaking of which, as we speak, Katie Hobbs is
is being
sworn in,
inaugurated.
being inaugurated.
Yeah, along with
formally.
everyone else.
They actually were on Monday, but because it was a holiday,
So
it was a private
congratulations
ceremony.
to her and
Yeah.
to all the candidates.
That's right.
Who justifiably won.
Although
But,
Carrie Lake is
Carrie
on
Lake is
Twitter,
still fighting.
well, she's out there saying that she is the duly elected governor of Arizona. So she is doubling down on the Trumpian belief that this election was rigged, which is sad.
Yeah. Well,
Sad.
I mean, when you, we've said it on this on this program, but when you alienate a key factors of the electorate, 2 or 3 weeks before the general election, when it's a winnable election for you, and you lean into your base and not broaden the base.
Well, not only
you're
you
going to
lean your
lose.
base, you tell Republicans, "I'm not interested in your vote,"
Yeah.
because that's what she said to people. Anyone who thought McCain was a good senator, she's like, "No,
Well,
you don't want me."
And Simon, you know this. I mean, there's a swath of well, maybe there are still moderate Democrats out there, but moderates who looked at McCain as someone they would vote for, who were rank and file Democrats. He won a lot of those people.
Sure.
Even with somebody like a Kirsten Sinema going independent, you're going to find a lot of those folks who are going to lean towards her. I'd be interested in what you see going forward, Simon, in terms of the landscape in Arizona and elsewhere.
Well,
For
the
the
most
party.
significant thing I think that happened in the election was that in the battlegrounds, the presidential battlegrounds, and now I'm talking about sort of the expanded battleground, Democrats made gains in a year that was supposed to be a bad year for us. I mean, we did better in Arizona, Colorado, Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and I'm forgetting one other state. I'll think of it in a second. There were 7 states where we actually did better in 2022 than we did in 2020, which is just an incredible performance. And I think that if you're the Republicans, one of the reasons I think you're seeing the Republican Party squawk so much about the election and be so concerned about what happened is that, we improved our standing in these key battleground states, meaning that we go into 2024, I think, favored to win the presidency, in my view. I mean, obviously, a lot's going to happen, and I got a lot right in 2020. But I think that, what we showed, the strength for the Democrats is that we improved in the battlegrounds. We also, I think what people don't really understand, and you saw this with Mark Kelly, is that the Democratic candidates, because of our grassroots fundraising, are raising so much more money than we used to, that we're now running much bigger campaigns than we ever did before. And those bigger campaigns are able to go in and do much more intense turnout with our episodic voters and the voters who are much less likely to vote, which we saw happen, as we saw in the early vote, right? I mean, the early vote, Democrats just crushed it in the early vote. That was a sign of organizational strength, right? Yeah. And in part because the campaigns we have now are 2-3 times bigger than they were a decade ago or 12 years ago. And I don't think really the people who comment on politics really understand the significance of this, because it may mean that Democrats may never have a drop off or bad turnout election again. And for a party that has many more voters who are irregular voters as part of our base than Republicans do, this issue of turnout is a really big issue for us, right? And it's why we spend so much money. And we've embraced the early vote in ways that we didn't before, and we really prospered. And so our campaigns also were better than Republican campaigns in the battlegrounds. And obviously, I think that as we head into 2024, assuming that the economy stays on track, and we might have a mild recession, but it's not supposed to be a big one, Democrats will be able to look back at these 4 years and say, look at these investments we made in chips and in infrastructure and in climate and all the things, you guys have seen investment out there in Arizona, right, that have come out from the bill, the bills that were passed by the Democrats. I think Democrats will have an even stronger case to make that, we did a good job and that we deserve to stay in power. And so, I look ahead feeling really good about where we are. I also will say that I think the Democratic Party, and you guys know what I'm about to say, as a party is very strong right now. Our next generation set of leaders, because part of what's begun to happen now with Pelosi in this sort of elegant transfer of power that happened in the House to a very competent set of new leaders for the Democrats. You heard Debbie Stabenow, the senator from Michigan today, announce that she's not running for re-election largely because she believes the next crew coming up in Michigan are so capable and talented, and she's not worried about them carrying on. Democrats feel right now, if you look at our party, right, Mark Kelly and Gavin Newsom and Jared Polis and the House members that survived the 2022 cycle, and Reverend Warnock and Pete Buttigieg, this is a strong party, right? These emerging leaders that are coming are very, very capable and strong. And so it means that, we're going to be ably led, I think, for the next 10 or 20 years. So, I think we've gone from having a lot of self-doubt and being, feeling like we were going to get crushed. I think a lot of Democrats believe the red wave was coming too, not just other commentators. But, I think today, I've been doing this for 30 years full time. I think the Democratic Party is as strong today as it's been during my time in this business. And so we go into this next cycle feeling good. Look, we all know from politics that things can change on a dime, and you gotta, when things feel good, you gotta let it feel good. You gotta take a win when you get it, right? Because there's lots of losses in this business, as you guys just right? But we are a stronger party today than we were in recent years, and I think we feel good.
Yeah, you should. I don't disagree with anything you said. And that doesn't feel good to say as a as a lifelong Republican, but you're right that the Democrats have figured out, and the Democrats have had a bit of an advantage when it comes to the ground game over the last few years. It really goes back, I think, Obama was the one who perfected this, and it's only gotten better. And Republicans continue to miss the mark on that regard. And Trump made it even worse because he started trashing the early voting process. I mean, Arizona, Republicans owned early voting for 2 decades.
They owned early voting across the whole country, by the way.
Right.
Early voting was a Republican thing. Democrats didn't do early vote. Right. I mean, Karl Rove and the direct mail guys are the guys that got Republicans habitually voting early to bank the votes early. This last presidential election was the first one where we really embraced early voting. I mean, this midterm we've seen a huge strategic change. I appreciate being able to talk to you about this because I just don't think this has been aired out enough. And in Arizona, for example, your Republican chair, a week before the election, changed her mind and started encouraging Republicans to vote early, right? Because they saw it was too late, but
don't get me started about our so-called Republican chair.
I know. I'm just saying, even she, right, realized pragmatically how many votes we were banking and how dangerous it was for the Arizona Republicans, and she changed her public position and started tweeting like crazy and doing public events around early voting. The Republicans now know they have a big structural problem, right? That we have an enormous, and I don't think that gap. I think even if the Republicans throw a lot of money at this, they're not going to be able to close that gap in the next 2 years. I mean, this is an advantage that we're going to have, in the 2024 cycle. The Republicans will be able to potentially lessen our advantage here on the ground, but they won't be able to close the gap. It's going to take more than one election cycle because we've now had 2 consecutive elections, the 2020 election and the 2022 election, where we have leaned into the early vote. And what's happening is that our voters are now our prime voters now understand that it's part of being a Democrat, you have to vote early.
Yeah.
And so, and what that does, as you guys understand, is it frees up the campaign resources to go out and, target lower propensity voters earlier in the process. And so we were turning out lower propensity voters for 10 days. Republicans were turning them out in the afternoon on election day. Obviously, doing it for 10 days is a lot better.
Yep.
And look, I think Republicans I think they've already strategically figured this out. I think there's going to be a sea change, but it's one of the reasons why, I think 2024 Democrats have I'd rather be us than them heading into 2024. It's one of the many reasons. What happens in Arizona and with your incumbent senator is going to be one of the most interesting stories of this election.
Yeah, I'm interested in your whole take on that. I mean, I'm sure Kirsten.
I do, and Gallego's going to run, I
of
think,
course,
right? I mean, certainly he seems like they announced staff they hired today, and I don't know what happens. I don't. I mean, there's a part of me which thinks she's not going to run again,
mm,
only because she's not really been acting like somebody who really wants to stay and loves the game, right? And loves the business and loves. She's not doing a lot of town halls and things with voters, right? She hasn't been in the state. She didn't campaign for Democrats or anybody in 2022. I mean, her disdain for day-to-day politics makes it very hard for her to stay in the business, right? And I don't. So I don't know what's going to happen. I think there's a very high likelihood she doesn't run again. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'll defer to you guys, right?
Well,
I mean,
I
you're
think that's
closer to it than I am.
I think that's a legitimate prognostication. I mean, she would to run again as an independent. I mean, it makes it very challenging. Now, obviously, she probably felt like she'd be challenged running in a primary against Gallego. I still happen to think that had she stayed Democrat and run against Gallego, she would have won the primary. But that's just me. I don't know internal Democrat politics enough to be good at guessing on that. But there is a path for her as an independent. If Gallego does run, then the left will go his direction, and if Republicans nominate a Trumpy, then there's clearly a path.
yeah.
The middle path that she could cut right up in the middle of the electorate is enough. You only need a plurality, so 32%, 33, 34, 35. That's definitely doable if Gallego is the Democrat nominee and Republicans nominate a hard right MAGA.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say about that is what gets hard for her is that gets harder in a presidential year than an off year. I mean, I think that, with Biden campaigning in the state, the Democratic Party is going to be very unified. There's going to be a massive coordinated campaign. I think it's more, that scenario is more possible in a non-presidential year. I think it gets very hard in a presidential year, which is why my guess is that she doesn't run again. But I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
it'll be very. I mean, we probably will know in the next
6 months or
few
so.
days, few weeks, couple months. I don't know. We'll see.
But she has, the ability to raise a lot of money. She has the ability to, I mean, she's one of the hardest workers politically that I've ever seen. And she has, she's kind of garnered, a lot of moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats I was speaking of before, really do like her.
Yeah.
So that, and I want to, mostly like the chamber Republicans, I would call them.
Yeah.
And so they've embraced her in a way that they probably would not, like you said, a right wing, Trumpian Republican.
Right. If Carrie Lake
and
runs,
certainly not Gallego. So there is, like you said, there is a path. It seems like how it'll transpire. The key question, Simon, that we've had on this show for some time, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot.
Yeah, no,
but
that's why I'm here. Go ahead.
But does Joe Biden make it to the election, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually?
Yeah. So
Because what we're seeing, I mean, I am going to challenge you on this. What we're seeing is the rapid mental decline of a once great leader of this country, and it seems like Democrats are sitting by and letting it happen, versus saying,
so
you know what?
Obviously, I can't agree with that characterization.
I understand you're not going to,
but what I will say is this, right? That if he wants to run for re-election, I think he will not be challenged. I think he'll have a clear path where there won't be. I don't think anyone will challenge him. I think the strong election, his approval rating is higher today than it's been in 15 months. I think there's a perception in the party that the way we closed legislatively at the end of 2022 was very strong and impressive. And so I think if he wants the nomination, it will be his, and he won't be challenged. I don't know what he's going to do, and I will support him. I mean, if he runs, I will be behind him 100%. But I don't know what he's going to do. I mean, he's got a big decision to make. He's got to not just have enough capacity to get through the election, but he's then got to serve for 4 more years. And I think that, the way that Pelosi bowed out, the way that Stabenow bowed out today, where she talked about how the next generation is so strong and she feels good and she feels like things are in good shape, so I can retire. I mean, those are messages that are not just being crafted for their own constituencies, right? I mean, there's clearly, a sense that, and this is what I just want to emphasize. I mean, my view on this is that if Joe Biden decides not to run, he's going to be able to say he's not running in part because he feels so good about what's coming next, and that our success in this election made it possible. Our success legislating, our success in the election made it possible for him to feel that he could step down and let the next generation come. And I think if he does not run, we are going to have a very vigorous primary. We'll have a lot of people get in. There won't be any clear front runner. Harris will not be, the anointed one. I mean, she's going to have to earn it. If she runs, she'll have to earn it. And I think we'll have a really robust primary that will put a lot of new faces, new younger faces into the national spotlight in a way that will be very advantageous to us as a party. As I said earlier, because I really am excited about the people that are coming. So, I think we win either way, right? We either win with an incumbent who's governed well, whose numbers are good enough, right? Who has a unified party behind him, or we have a vigorous primary that helps, this generational wheel that is beginning to turn in the Democratic Party. I mean, one of the biggest stories in the Democratic Party for the next few years is going to be the transition from the party of the Clintons and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden and, Nancy Pelosi to the next Democratic Party. And I think that transition, I'm very optimistic about that transition, much more so today than I was even, 6 months ago or 12 months ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be interesting to see because, obviously the Republican side, we're going to have a contentious process. There's just no
without
question.
And there will not be an anointing this time around.
So it does. So that then kind of puts us on the spotlight of what's happening this week in D.C. or what's not happening.
Yeah.
We don't have a speaker. And, Trump has supported McCarthy, and yet the 19 no votes for McCarthy, and I call it 19 because
20.
Well, I put Byron Donalds as just the guy he's not really a part of that rump crowd. We had Andy Biggs on the podcast a month ago, almost. And I went back and listened to that podcast because I had been a little bit frustrated yesterday that, look, McCarthy's been giving these concessions to the Freedom Caucus guys, and they're still opposing him. Are they moving the goalpost? But when I went back and listened to the Biggs podcast that we did, I mean, he was saying it can't be McCarthy. It wasn't just the reforms. He personally was saying it can't be McCarthy, and he is stuck with that. And so that may not be the case where Chip Roy is or a handful of these others, but if you look at Gates, Boebert, and Biggs, for sure, they are definitely anybody but McCarthy. So I say all that because these are, very hardcore Trumpians, but Trump is supporting McCarthy, but they haven't moved that. So, does this to me looks like a diminishing of Trump's influence? Simon?
Look, this has been
don't gloat too much on what's happening.
No. I'm. The truth is, I don't think this is good for the country, right?
No.
So I'm not really in the gloating phase. I think our fear. I used to say during my period about when I would talk about the election, I would say the worst possible outcome for the Republicans would be if we keep the Senate and they have the House with less than 10 votes. And I argued that this would actually be worse for them than us keeping the House. Mm-hmm. And because I expected what we're seeing now, which remember may continue for the next 2 years. I mean, the concessions that McCarthy's making, even if he doesn't end up being the speaker, the concessions are weakening the speakership and weakening the hold of the leaders of the Republican Party over their conference. Mm-hmm. meaning that the MAGA 20, whatever we call them, are going to be stronger now, not weaker.
Right.
They will be more capable of causing chaos and dissenting and preventing basic operations from happening, whether it's the debts, the debt ceiling or just passing a budget, right? That we need to keep the government open and the country moving forward. And so the fear that everyone has to have is that the possibility of these 20 taking steps that do enormous harm, not to the Republican Party, but to the country itself, is actually increasing as we go further into this, because the concessions that are being made are making them more powerful. And that's what Republicans, just everyday Republicans, should be worried about. That McCarthy's weakness, the fact that he brought this to a vote. I mean, it sure seemed that they thought the dissenters were going to be in the single digits, not in the double digits. They seemed surprised by the number of people who opposed him. It seemed like McCarthy perhaps was operating under wishful thinking about what was going to happen here, and that somehow magically it was all going to be okay. And at the end of this, the country's coming out of this weaker. The concessions that McCarthy's making have made it far harder for the House to operate in a functional manner. That's bad for the country. And so, yeah, I'm stunned as somebody who's been in this business a long time. I think McCarthy is demonstrating in some ways publicly why it is that there's so little love for him in the caucus, because he seems to have just really been really blown it, right, on a really fundamental level. And I don't know what happens. I mean, I think certainly what I wrote about yesterday, and I know this is also possibly equal levels of wishful thinking, is that there's some kind of power sharing arrangement brought in where a speaker, a former like Upton, who's a former member, comes in, where Democrats support this sort of this nonpartisan speaker, so that we can run the Congress without the votes of these 20 people. Because if the leader of the Republican Party continues to need their votes, we're in a period of danger for the Republic. And because they've demonstrated they're willing to do whatever, right? And so it is possible that whoever becomes the speaker, because I actually don't think it's going to be McCarthy at this point, but I could be wrong, right? That speakership collapses in 2 months or 3 months because they can pull the plug whenever they want, basically, right? And I don't know. And so it's possible where we end up by the spring is in some kind of weird temporary arrangement with a caretaker speaker that marginalizes the 20, allows us to make sure we can increase the debt ceiling, get the budget done, some of the basics, right? Nothing fancy. We need an immigration bill. Senator Sinema has been a leader in trying to, forge a bipartisan consensus. I think the president finally leaned into immigration and the border today in a way that, frankly, he hadn't really before. I think he's going to be visiting the border next week. This is obviously going to be a major priority. I think we could see a major bipartisan immigration border bill pass, I hope, by the summer. It would certainly be good for Arizona and good for the country. So, I don't know what's going to happen. I do think, though, that it would be wise for people not to put lipstick on this pig, right? Like it would be wise for people not to, to be honest about the gravity of what we're witnessing here, and not to pretend like everything is going to be fine, because I just don't think that that's necessarily going to be the case.
Well,
I agree 100% with that assessment.
And
I can't find any issue with that. It's embarrassing for the country. It's bad for the country. It's bad for the republic. You would have thought that many of these issues would have been hashed out over the course of the 2 months in a way that would not bring us to this point. But obviously, these individuals, or these rebels, as they're calling them, they're raising a lot of money too, Simon. It's all about the money.
Well, there's a lot of that.
And there's a lot of that going on right now, which makes even their complaints of McCarthy, although I have my own issues with him over time. People forget that he was up for speaker before, and he got torpedoed because of some allegations about some improprieties in his personal life, and we don't need to go into those. But that in and of itself, all those years ago, has developed a weakness of his persona. And I think these individuals saw a way to exploit that And to your point, they're going to the mat with it, and he may or may not be speaker. And even if he is speaker, he's going to be one of the weakest speakers in recent
Well,
memory.
whoever is the speaker is going to be the weakest, as you pointed out, Simon. But I think that I disagree that I don't know that it is an existential threat to the United States. I think chaos is not necessarily a bad thing. Ultimately, what's going to happen is these things will work themselves out. They usually do. And I think it may be that you're right, Simon, that there's some type of temporary power sharing agreement. But man, that would cause just
that'd be
huge
that I
chaos.
hope does not happen.
Well, do you know what's interesting is that there have been two states in the last couple days, Ohio, I think it's Ohio and Pennsylvania, where Republicans and Democrats came together to elect a leader of the House that marginalized the far right in both states, where there was essentially a power sharing agreement. It's already happened twice this week. And the reason I raise that is that there is something they could do that could be devastating. There are two things they could do that would be devastating to the country. And they've already said they were going to do them, right? So we should listen to them and take them seriously. You had Biggs on, and as part of the demands from the rebels was that if you go back and look at their original document, one of the things they talked about is they're not going to sign on to any budget that doesn't eliminate the budget deficit in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not possible, right? That's not possible. There is no, we could raise taxes a
You'd have
lot
to raise
help
taxes
get rid of
40%.
Well, you'd have to
Right.
do that.
So-
and cut spending at the same time by 30%.
Right. So that's not going to happen.
I read
so
the analysis.
They've already put out a demand on the basic budget process that's not possible to achieve. They have all come out against the recent omnibus that was signed off on by the Senate Republicans as being something they wouldn't have supported. And so part of their demands is that they're going to demand that basically Joe Biden cut enormous chunks of the legislation that he just passed. And that's not going to happen under any circumstances. And so we're already at an incredible impasse that could take the country down because the government will shut down and they don't budge. They continue to raise money. They do exactly what they're doing here, right? And we go into default and the entire global economic system collapses. Is that possible? Yeah, it's completely possible. In fact, they said they're going to do it. So I just don't think we should really minimize the gravity here of what we're facing because it is the House of Representatives. This is a serious place. They have a lot of power, and it isn't, Fox News and performative Republican politics. They have real responsibilities now, right? And if they don't execute them, and if they choose performance over governing, they could do serious harm. I think that if we could wall off, one of the things that have been discussed is that would the Democrats ever come over and back a Republican speaker? I think that the conditions for that would be that we would have to wall off the budget and the debt ceiling debate from any of the ability for them to sabotage those two things, right? So I do think that's why this is a really consequential what's happening now, in addition to all the other things about dysfunction and can you run a party and blah, 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 which are worrisome. And I think the last thing I'll say to you guys, because this is your own origins as political people, is that, perhaps this is going to help accelerate and loosen the grip of MAGA over the Republican Party. Right. Part of what you're talking about is that MAGA is now bigger than Trump. It's outlasted Trump. It's spread to Arizona. It's way beyond Trump at this point. And I would like to have the old Republican. I'd like to have the party of Flake and McCain back. I'd like to have a more traditional center-right, conservative political party back. And so maybe the embarrassment of what's happening here is going to help loosen the grip of MAGA over the Republican Party, which I think would be great for the country.
It might be. It's the challenge is it's going to take at least 2 or 3 cycles
I think you're right.
really kind of settle out. Which, to your point earlier, Simon, is why Democrats feel pretty optimistic because the chaos within the Republican ranks is at an all-time high. And, we are divided as a party more than, well, far more than the Democrats are. But more than we've ever been. I mean, I think this is a bigger divide than the Goldwater Rockefeller divide in the 60s.
Oh, that's interesting.
Do you think so?
comparison.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you?
I really do
That's
think
a
so.
fascinating. I will defer to you on that because I've actually been trying to figure out whether or not what's an analogous moment. to
So,
this, right?
so
Because-
yeah,
Yeah.
That is a very interesting. I hadn't even thought about that.
well, because it's there's been a shift. I mean, the Rockefeller wing of the party was much bigger than the Goldwater wing back then, and maybe I've got that a little bit wrong. Maybe it's still what would be seen as the Rockefeller wing is still a little bit smaller, but I mean, clearly not as vocal as the Trump wing or the MAGA wing, let's call it. But I mean, all you have to do is look at where, the Trump endorsed candidates, like
Yep.
here in Arizona,
Yep.
they lost. They lost because there were enough Republicans who said, you know what, I'm not taking it anymore. I'm not doing that anymore. And more importantly, well, not maybe as importantly, a ton of independents, because independents are the second largest block of voters in Arizona after Republicans, said, no, not buying that.
And a good majority who probably identify as center right. I'm going through this in my head, and today's MAGA Republican would look at Barry Goldwater as a rhino.
They would. They would.
Right.
I mean,
Well,
it's just
because-
it's unfathomable for me to say that, but it's absolutely true. And the conscience of a conservative is still. I mean, it's the Bible of Republican politics. At least it should be.
Well, it should be.
And these people are destroying it.
So let's talk about that for a second because I think it's really important what you just said because these are not conservatives.
Right.
I mean,
That's
the Republican
exactly
Party
right.
is no longer a conservative party. It's a MAGA party. MAGA's replaced conservative as the governing ideology of the Republican Party. And, Ron Brownstein, who's one of the best political journalists in the country, has done a lot of analysis of this. And he really believes that about 80% of Republican voters essentially line up with MAGA. When you sort of, it doesn't, and which means 20 don't. I mean, it's the opposite in some ways of what you would think. And so I think the Republican Party, I really think this idea that you've raised about the divide is really important because I do think there's two parties now. I mean, if we were in a parliamentary system, there would be a center-right party and then there would be the MAGA party. There'd be two parties. Liz Cheney is not in the same party as Matt Gaetz, right? They're not any longer. And you're right. I think that divide is as big as any divide that we've seen in the modern era of American politics. And it makes it very difficult to understand how Republicans can win national elections because it will take a very special politician to be able to bridge that divide. And I don't think Ron DeSantis, for example, is that guy. I think Ron DeSantis has really sort of doubled down his identification with MAGA. I think, look, what I'll posit to the two of you for you to kick around for the next few months is, and you should get people on from Florida to talk about DeSantis because he's obviously a major new figure in the Republican Party.
Well, he was the bright spot in the last election.
Yeah, but
Right.
I think he made a big error. I think he made an error, I think he made a red wave error. I think that he believed that the election was going towards them more than it really did, and it did in Florida. But he became more MAGA as the election went on. Since the election, he's now talking about reducing abortion, from 15 weeks down to 6 weeks, right? I mean, he's moving more to the right. He's gone to the right of Trump on a bunch of things. And I think that's a huge misread of what just happened in the election. It may not be a misread of what happened in Florida, but in terms of outside of Florida and the rest of the country, I think Ron DeSantis has misread the national mood, and will make it very difficult for him to reach, swing voters because because remember, in the battlegrounds now, you've had 3 consecutive elections where MAGA was rejected. And so the voters in those states won't need a lot to say, oh my God, he's one of those guys, right? He's one of those Republicans. He's not a good Republican. He's just a little too crazy for me. because they voted on that 3 times now, right?
Right.
And so that's the danger for DeSantis. If somehow he defeats Trump and Trump, is goes in, and plays ball and endorses him and tries to unify the party, DeSantis still feels very MAGA to me, and I think we will look back potentially as him having made, kind of the kind of mistake you make as a younger politician new to the national stage, right? Who's not quite ready yet. He's like a baseball player in AAA, right? If we can use a baseball analogy, who's hit 30 home runs, but he hasn't yet made it into the major leagues. And I think DeSantis may have made a big error in his transition from being a Florida politician to a national one. But we'll see.
Well,
I could be completely
so
wrong about that.
I don't know that it's an error. I think it's a calculation that he's got to get through a primary and he's got to get past Trump. So I think he's probably not thinking the second or third step down,
No.
which is where you are, Simon.
Yeah.
And so if he were to get through the primary, get past Trump,
Well, and it's going to be a crowded primary.
the only way that I can see Trump supporting DeSantis is if Trump decides not to run and figures that'll be the way he can be relevant. Because if Trump runs and DeSantis beats him in the primary, there's no way in hell Trump's going to endorse him for president in the general. It's not going to happen.
So the one way that I heard people have speculated is that DeSantis will have to promise that he's going to pardon Trump, which of course will make it impossible for DeSantis to win the election, right? And
Yep.
so, thank you for laughing, because it's an incredible scenario. I don't envy the Republicans right now. This is a very Trump is a dark figure and in our history and in the Republican Party. He's done enormous harm to the Republican Party, and
Because he was never a Republican. That's the thing. He was never a Republican.
No.
This has been a show. This has been a facade. The guy doesn't have any core philosophy, and
Yep.
I just to watch people who I believed were true conservatives who cared about the Constitution follow this guy and have undying fealty for him has just been the biggest disappointment of my life.
Wow, that's a big statement. And yet, many of those policies and many of those ideas that he supported, we support.
Well,
And that's
those
that
weren't
and that's the
him.
hardest. I know they weren't his, but that's one of the hardest things being a conservative right now and watching what Trump is doing.
Well, but because he made accommodations, right? He changed a lot of his positions from the campaign. He, and became more of a traditional Republican once he got to Washington. He made accommodations for McConnell and some of the Republican agenda, right? To his credit, because to your point, he didn't really have a core philosophy. He just wanted to be the boss. And so, listen, I do think the Republican Party is on a tough and long journey now. And for the good of the country, it is important. I will tell you that I think one of the jobs Democrats have is that, and I've been arguing this for years, is that we need to make it clear. We need to make MAGA and the extremism of the Republican Party central to our argument, because Republicans have to feel that they're losing because of MAGA. And that's when the grip of MAGA starts to loosen. And I think that that didn't happen in 2018 and 2020. I think it sort of did this time. I think there was a sense that, the extremism, not just bad candidates is a cop-out, right? It's much worse than that. Bad candidates are the result of a bad party, right, that can't manage its affairs and has been overtaken by extremism. And so I think in Washington, look at McConnell, right? McConnell, on the day of this meltdown, McConnell, during this week of this meltdown in the House, McConnell's going out and doing an event with Joe Biden.
right.
Yeah, I saw that.
And creating as much distance from himself as MAGA and what the Republicans in the House are doing as possible. It's almost impossible for Mitch to have sent a clearer signal about how he feels like he's in a different path now than the House Republicans, right? And so, because they feel very burned. They know that they didn't win the Senate because of MAGA, not because of bad candidates. So, And the candidates were bad because in part they believed in MAGA.
Right.
It wasn't just that they were bad candidates, right? And so anyway, it is. I think the goal here has to be to not. We just got news that McCarthy's seventh vote just went
Just
down.
went
Right?
down.
I
Yep.
don't see the number, but the important thing is that the goal as a nation, the bipartisan goal, is to loosen the grip of MAGA. And I do think that one of the things for you guys to be talking about in the future episodes is the role of the Never Trumpers. Liz Cheney came to Arizona, told Republicans, created a permission structure for Republicans not to vote for the MAGA candidates there. She went to Michigan. She traveled around the country. Bill Kristol's organization spent $10 million in the battleground of ads of Republicans looking at the camera and saying, I can't vote for so-and-so. They've just gone too far. The Never Trumper movement has gotten bigger and it's more mature than it was, 2 years ago. You saw large numbers of Republicans endorsing Democrats in Nevada and Colorado and Michigan, Pennsylvania, right, where big, prominent Republicans did things that don't happen in our business, right?
Right.
Where, 150 Republicans who were serious Republicans, not just names on a piece of paper, endorsed Gretchen Whitmer in her race in Michigan, right? And so we've seen now Republican elected officials, prominent Republicans in many of these states, align themselves with Democrats temporarily. There's not a permanent alliance, but that alliance, it's possible, needs to be strengthened in order to shake MAGA out of the Republican Party. And that's why it's going to be very interesting to see what Liz Cheney does. I mean, if we were in a parliamentary democracy, Liz Cheney would have been brought into the cabinet for Joe Biden, right? There would have been an embrace of Bill Kristol and the Never Trumpers, and there would have been a formal structural arrangement. We don't really have a mechanism to do that in our politics, but I think watch for that in the coming months, because I think Joe Biden made it very clear for his first event after in the new year to be with Mitch McConnell and the Republican governor of Ohio, DeWine, was a pretty important signal that he was sending that he intends to work with reasonable Republicans to get things done and to create further distance with MAGA. And I think that there's a lot that the Never Trumpers, as we call them, they don't really have a real name, but I call them the Never Trumpers. I think Liz Cheney and Bill Kristol and those that fought so hard deserve a lot of credit. I think they created permission structures for 2 to 3%. What I think I talked about when I was on your show last was that this effort, even if it's just 2 to 3% of the electorate, the overall electorate is a Republican who then doesn't vote for MAGA. That could be the difference between winning and losing in the election.
Yep.
Well, in Arizona, it probably was, right?
It easily was.
Right?
It easily was. And
so that's also played out all over the country, though, and so it's a fascinating thing to watch about what happens. I've gotten to know Bill Kristol very well. I'm now working with former Republicans or former temporary Republicans, right, in ways that were unimaginable for somebody like me. I mean, Michael Steele is my new buddy, right, the former head of the RNC.
Yeah.
Who's out there. I mean, imagine the former head of the National Republican Party campaign, so virulently pushing people away from the Republicans. These are extraordinary events, and I think that there's material here for us to build this into sort of a durable anti-MAGA majority that sucks the oxygen out of the room for MAGA and helps restore sanity in the country. That's my hope. But let's see. We got a lot of work to do. And thank you for what you guys are doing. I always appreciate the sober and sensible discourse, despite being a show that has beer in its title. And
that's only because all great conversations start with beer. Yeah. I mean, even President Obama, had the beer summit with Bud Light. Yeah. I would ask. And made inroads during his presidency. So I will say that.
Anyone who works in campaigns know that free beer is very critical.
Well, and here's the other truth of American politics. It always comes down when a undecided voter goes into that voting booth or gets his ballot and sends it in, his or her ballot. It all comes down to who would you rather have a beer with. That is the age-old axiom.
That was W's superpower, right?
Yeah. Who would you rather have a beer with? You know,
That was W's superpower.
well, we've done a lot of
Yeah.
dissecting of never Trumpers, and we're running out of time. But I guess the only other thing I would add is that the Democratic Party has its own issues, and you know, in terms of ideas, in terms of it's lurched to the left, it's lurched towards socialism. It's got a problem with free speech. The Twitter files that are coming out in ad nauseum are showing that. So we all have our issues that we got to work on either side.
Well, and that's worthy of another show. We'll have to bring Simon back for
I'll come back. I'll come back for that one. Come back in a couple months.
But I think you've made some great points and great observations. Your analysis leading into the election was top notch, and so I applaud you for that.
Can I just say one thing about Derek? Look, we're not perfect. We got a lot of issues. We're going through a generational transition that's going to be bumpy and challenging, and we've got a lot of young, headstrong members who have ideas that are different than mine, right? But I think that at this point, the establishment and the pragmatists are prevailing, and that's the difference between us and the Republicans. The establishment of the Republican Party failed, and it lost control to extremists. That hasn't happened on our side, and I don't think it is going to happen either, right? I do think that, Hakeem Jeffries is, isn't well known, but he's very much kind of an establishment, pragmatic Democrat. It doesn't mean we're perfect and we've got issues to manage. There's no question about that. But I do think that I'll put our track record over the last couple of years. I'm very proud of what we got done. And I think that the investments, the things that I'm most proud of the last 2 years is these 3 big economic bills, CHIPS, climate bill, and the infrastructure bill are going to position America to be the leading economic power for the next generation. And Republicans played a role in a bunch of that, not all of it, right? But on the infrastructure bill, Republicans were there with us in getting that done.
Well, our governor was certainly cheering the CHIPS bill.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
look,
took a victory lap with Joe Biden on that.
Yeah, no, just a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was a hugely important bill for Arizona, and Arizona is going to benefit dramatically from all 3 of these bills. And we have to find a way of celebrating the fact that I think that the country, despite it all, despite COVID, despite January 6th, despite the craziness of our politics, some really important things actually got done. They're going to make things a lot better for America. And we have to allow that to be true, in addition to all these other things being true too, So thanks, guys. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon.
Hopefully I can come visit in the flesh in the spring. I'm gonna
that'd be great.
make it out for spring training, and it's always one of my greatest. And I go to spring training in Arizona, by the way, not Florida. I want to be very clear about that when I do it.
That's the only place really to do it now.
Yeah, that's where all the great teams are.
Absolutely.
But Simon, we appreciate you. We appreciate all the work that you're doing, and congratulations on your victory lap. We'll have you on again. You're actually this is the second time. Second time.
Yeah.
He's not
Second time.
He's not a threefer.
We'll do a three for the 3 for
in the
later.
spring.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks, Simon.
See you guys.
Thanks. God bless.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.